In this short video, I want to summarize and clarify some key points from my first presentation. As you recall, we made a list of famous thinkers, and we had trouble coming up with anyone before the ancient Greeks. In fact, there were some very smart people in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt making many important advances in the fields of mathematics and astronomy before the Greeks were even on the map. The problem is that we don't exactly know who they were because historical records are very scarce. What are the historical records? As we discussed, the surviving Egyptian hieroglyphics are mostly found on temples, tombs, and monuments, and don't tell us much about their intellectual achievements. We can assume that they must have recorded those achievements in math and astronomy on papyrus sheets, a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant which grew in great abundance in the Nile Delta. They would have used Demotic script, as we discussed. The problem for historians is that papyrus is not very durable. Egyptologists have been able to study a few surviving scraps of papyrus records from that period, but we can only assume that the vast majority of the original manuscripts are lost forever because Demotic script fell out of use entirely during the time of the Roman Empire, and at that point there was no one left to make fresh copies. In contrast, although we have very few original manuscripts from ancient Greece, there was among the educated clergy in the Middle Ages enough interest in preserving the legacy of ancient Greece that they made sure scribes produced fresh copies of at least some of the most important ancient documents, over and over again as needed throughout the centuries. The Babylonians were a bit more helpful to modern historians because they wrote things down in cuneiform on clay tablets, which are much more durable than papyrus. Even so, most of our insight into Babylonian achievements in mathematics comes from a single discovery of some 400 tablets that are over 3,000 years old. We can assume that much of Babylonian knowledge has been lost because, just as in the case of ancient Egyptian Demotic script, cuneiform script eventually fell out of use, and again there was no one to make fresh copies of whatever additional records once existed. All that said, if we compare the situation in Egypt and Greece around 500 to 340 BC, we can see why Greece was in a better position to give rise to an explosion of intellectual achievements. This time frame encompasses the birth of democracy in Athens and its spread to roughly half of the 1,000 or so Greek city-states. Meanwhile, Egyptians were still living under a centralized autocratic government. And the pharaoh was also the central religious authority appointed by the gods. In Greece, there was no central religious authority, and there was a greater degree of separation of religion and politics in Greek culture. Having said that, I also have to tell you that Socrates himself was prosecuted and ultimately executed on charges that he was promoting ideas to his students that were contrary to traditional Greek religion. However, there were other known atheists and skeptics of Greek religion at the time who were never prosecuted. Certainly, Socrates promulgated his beliefs and teachings publicly for a long time before he got in trouble with the authorities. In fact, some scholars have argued that the charge of heresy was used by those authorities as an excuse to get rid of a political enemy. We might even imagine that it had never occurred to Socrates beforehand that he would one day be arrested and sentenced to death for contradicting traditional religious teachings. Recall that we discussed that the Greek people benefited from a much more diverse economy, all of which led to the development of a thriving market economy and a generally prosperous middle class. Finally, the Greeks enjoyed the practical benefits of the first true phonetic alphabet, which represented a major advance in the history of written communication. The combination of all these factors led to a growing middle class living in a relatively free society that was motivated to provide a good education to its children and could afford to do so. Socrates, as an example, did not come from an aristocratic family. His father was a stoneworker, a member of the rather ordinary craftsman class. However, he was a very successful stoneworker and a relatively affluent member of that class. Plato, a student of Socrates, founded the Academy in 387 BC. The Academy was open to the public. It was attended primarily by upper-class men, though women were allowed to attend. There were no fees. Scholars gathered at the Academy to share ideas. Lectures were given. Debates were held. Aristotle studied at the Academy for 20 years before accepting an invitation from the king of Macedon to serve as the private tutor for the king's son, Alexander. Alexander's later military successes led to the establishment of an enormous empire, which in turn led to the spread of Greek culture to Egypt and to a huge part of Asia, stretching from what we now call the Middle East to the western part of modern-day India. He is known to us today as Alexander the Great. The influence of Greek culture, especially its reverence for learning, was especially profound in Egypt. This influence is best exemplified by the establishment under Greek leadership of a prominent research institute in Alexandria, Egypt, known as the Museion. The Museion included one of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world, known appropriately as the Great Library of Alexandria. As a result, Alexandria came to be regarded as the capital of knowledge and learning. At our next meeting, when we talk about the history of astronomy and the birth of science, we will begin with Ptolemy, a Greek astronomer based in Alexandria. I want to emphasize two takeaway lessons here. The first lesson has to do with our knowledge of history, and it is a lesson that I know you learn in your Hoda course. The main theme in TOK in general is how do we know what we know? When it comes to knowledge of history, we are highly dependent on our sources. What sources are available to us? How reliable are they? What are their biases? Are we missing sources that might provide a different perspective? We wish we had more sources from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia with regard to their pursuit of knowledge. However, as someone once said, history is written by the victors. Certainly in the realm of political and cultural conflict, Greece was the ultimate victor over Egypt. The second takeaway message that I want to propose is that knowledge expands most rapidly when people live in a free society where they can speak and write freely without fear of persecution, and where a good education, including easy access to the writings of others, is widely available. In Western Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, this social situation was essentially non-existent until the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed.